Hey everyone, thanks for joining this meeting. Our presenter will just be joining soon. Please make sure that your team participants have joined this meeting and also the WhatsApp group. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. हाँ सर की मैं कह रहा हूँ
Hello. Hello.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah, can you
Thank you for
hear?
joining us. Yes, we can hear you, sir. Thank you.
So I think what I'll do is because I'm presenting from my phone, I might as well mail the PowerPoint to you, if that's okay.
Yes, sir, that'll be fine.
So all I would do is just during the course of presentation, I would just say the next slide. I think one of you can, just help me out.
Okay, sir.
Sure.
We'll just start the workshop in 2-3 minutes.
Just see if you could, get my presentation, which I've emailed. I've mailed it to the ReWire at Shaastra. To the ReWire at Shaastra.
Okay, can you start?
Yeah, we can start if everyone's ready.
Okay, I'll just start by introducing ReWire.
Yeah, sure.
So ReWire is a student-led initiative under Shaastra 2025, which is dedicated to enhancing the cognitive abilities and positively impacting the lives of neurodivergent children. So this competition, Cognify, is presented by Shaastra IIT Madras in collaboration with Velprashanth. We invite participants across India to present toy concepts that foster cognitive development and inclusivity for these children.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Cognify workshop. It is our privilege today to have with us Dr. Velprashanth Venkatesan, who will be leading us through a session on neurocognition and cognitive functions. Dr. Venkatesan is an esteemed psychiatrist, having earned his MD in psychiatry from the Central Institute of Psychiatry in Ranchi, where he was recognized with the Best Psychiatry Resident Award and the Gold Medal. He further pursued his DM in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the Postgraduate Institute of Medical Education and Research in Chandigarh, one of the premier institutes in the country. Dr. Venkatesan has received extensive training across a broad range of ideas, including psychiatric emergencies, substance use disorders, mood and anxiety disorders, psychotic spectrum disorders, childhood developmental disorders, and epilepsy. His clinical approach integrates cognitive behavioral therapy and family focused therapies, with a focus on creating personalized treatment plans for each patient. He is a member of respected organizations such as the Indian Psychiatric Society and the Indian Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, and his contributions to the field are reflected in several research papers covering topics ranging from circadian rhythms in bipolar disorder to the influence of Western colonial psychology on Indian thought. We are deeply honored to have Dr. Venkatesan with us today. Please join me in welcoming him as he shares his expertise with us.
Thank you for the precious welcome. So I think most of us, we have all gathered here to do something which is very important and also very unique. It's something which is an idea that would actually go a long way in shaping the culture of inclusive designing, where we are going to deal with a lot of different kinds of children who have different kinds of developmental issues, and also pave the way towards bringing uniquely the neuroscience aspect in something which is as unique as a toy design. And I'm sure many of you had already given your inputs in the pre-assessments that we have sent out. A lot of you come from a core background in the design, and some of you do have a lot of background in working with children who have neurodivergent issues. And also, I did see a couple of participants who also have some background in neuroscience. So I think we have a very interesting and a mixed group here. So I thank the organizers for this opportunity. So let's get on with the presentation. So this presentation will have two parts. What we will deal with today would be more of the science, and what we will deal in the part two would be something of the practical aspect. So these are my learning objectives. In the second slide, please. Could anyone move to the next slide?
Just a second, sir.
Yeah, sure.
I think it will take a little bit of time to reflect. Is it reflected?
I'm just waiting for my end. I think if you are ready with the second slide, I will just, start anyways. The things that we will discuss today in our part one of this introductory workshop, it would be an introduction to neurodevelopment in its core aspects. And we would delve deeply into the unique developmental aspect of the brain, and we will also try to understand things from a different domain aspect, the kinds of domains that your brain has when it comes to neurocognition. And within neurocognition, it's quite a vast area. So what I would try to do today is just to give a brief overview and to get you as designers to get a perspective of the kind of distinct areas that a child can just show while the child is playing. But the truth here would be there are so many different mechanisms that are coming together from different areas of the brain that are cohesively playing a role while the child is playing, and the experience of play adds to these unique domains of neurocognition. And we would finally go into a brief understanding of children who have neurodivergent conditions, and also certain aspects. We'll just touch upon what we understand as sensory processing and sensor integration. So, next slide. Next slide. So, the first understanding here is what is neurodevelopment. We need to remember neurodevelopment applies to a process that starts right from the time a child starts, getting conceived in the womb of the mother. So it's basically the process through which your entire nervous system starts slowly developing, and it starts showing up in ways your cognition, the motor aspects, and the social emotional aspect of a person's behavior slowly starts building up. And it starts building up in processes of milestones. It starts from something as simple as the child learning to see and recognize something as a light. And it goes on to a process where the child is able to put himself or herself in another person's shoes. And it goes on into an amazing level of complexity, which goes beyond a level of even human comprehension to this point. And a lot of these things have, interestingly, two kinds of influences. The first influence is very much a genetic influence, which is something which is deemed to be so. A child is born with a certain DNA, born with certain genetic architecture, which is going to give what we call as the nature aspect of this child. So this is going to happen whether you like it or not. But then interestingly, there is equally a contribution from the environment in which this child is going to grow. And it's this beautiful interaction between the gene and the environment, where you're actually seeing the dance of what we call as the epigenetic play, where both the expression of certain aspects of gene is directly influenced by the expression which is allowed by the environment. And this is where you, as a person who is a designer, are going to directly play a role here. You're going to create a toy. Basically, you're going to create an experience which is going to directly influence a growing child's brain while the child is growing up. So that is the profound impact of what you're going to create here. Next slide. So I won't go too much into detail because this would be just a little bit of a boring core science, but I have to anyways. See, the brain development has these terminologies which you need to remember right from the level of the cell. It starts from something as simple as a neurogenesis, basically the creation of the simplest element of your brain called the neuron. And what happens, interestingly, is right from the time the child is in the womb, there are these processes that take over. There's a process called migration where there is a predetermined location for each of these neurons to slowly migrate from a single cell organism. And as the child is expanding, as the child is growing, these neurons start going into different allocated locations, part of which is genetically determined as well. And these neurons start connecting, making branches with each other. And these branches are called your axons and dendrites. And slowly between these neurons, there is a connection. There is an interaction that happens, which is called as the neural synapse. And the creation of this synapse happens. And beautifully, there is this process of maturation where each area starts getting its unique roles and specializations as this person grows. And then as the child reaches a point where there is a little bit of a toddler to a child who's growing into a school age, something called myelination happens. Myelination is now this entire brain cell starts getting an almost a makeover of a highway path, where all your connections starts taking a high or update into a more faster system of connection, where basically this deposition of fatty layers in these neurons is called myelination, which is going to make the flow of information between neurons absolutely stunningly much faster in terms of micro nanoseconds. Next slide. So as you're getting familiar with these words like migration, synapses, myelination, just you can take a look at this beautiful picture as it's shown here. Right from the first few weeks, as this little womb is getting formed, this embryo, this few cells that have come together and is slowly becoming this multicellular organization. There is this process that is going here. You can just see and visualize the timeline that is happening here. So what they spoke about Abhimanyu is pretty much a fact. There is a direct influence of your environment as the child is inside the womb. And this process slowly takes over a few weeks. And so much of this happens right before the child is even born. And after the child gets born, something miraculous happens where the size of the brain grows exponentially in the very first few years. As they say, 90% of the brain size that we have as of now as adults was attained way back when we were just around 4 to 5 years. And that's something which gave me a gasp every time I think about that. Next slide. So the next word that I would like to introduce to you is the concept of neuroplasticity. One of the basic things that we've all learned in school biology is your neuron cells do not change too much. Anytime there is a damage to the brain, those damages tend to be permanent. Well, there is a bit of a truth to it, but it's not completely true. The fascinating truth here is there is a process called neuroplasticity where your brain still can try to adapt to any kind of a damage. And at the same time, if the environment demands a particular change, there are ways in which how your branches, we talked about things like migration, we talked about axons, dendrons, synapses, how these things get organized into circuits. These circuits can change with experience. And this capacity of our brain to do this is what we call as neuroplasticity. And a lot of situations demands immediate neuroplasticity. A person who's paralyzed somewhere immediately has to adapt. A person who is suddenly in a deprived environment suddenly has to adapt, and the brain does this adaptation using what we understand as neuroplasticity, which is the foundation for basic capacity for all of us to learn, recognize, and create new skill sets in our brain. Next slide. So here you could see there are two kinds of plasticity that is understood. One, which is the structural plasticity, where you're looking at actual changes in the density of synapses. You're actually changing the kind of the structural image that your brain is going to be visualized as you look into a functional MRI or any kind of a neuroimaging. And there you can clearly see some level of changes in the gyri and the sulci of your brain. And that can happen much in younger children or very small children. But as they grow into adulthood, this is where there is the understanding of after a point of time, your brain cells do not evolve or change too much. So then, it's not the structural change that happens, interestingly. This is where we need to tweak a little bit of understanding. The change does happen, but the changes later in the ages are more of a functional plastic changes. By functional, I mean the structure pretty much is the same, but these circuits that happen all through your neurons can change the way they are integrated based on the requirement that is given from the environment. Next slide. So just looking into this slide, just briefly touching upon the influence of experience and genetics. So the whole idea here is to just visualize how both the gene and environment can play a role. Initially, the neuron differentiation, migration, all that could be a genetically programmed thing. But then as the child is experiencing the real world environments, the things like synaptic plasticity, the birth of new synapses, all these things are directly influenced by the environment. And there is a gray area where there is a bit of both getting influenced. Next slide. So now that we've understood that over a period of time, there is a way in which the brain can adapt. As a young child, there is a lot of changes that can take place in the brain, even at the level of structure. But as the child grows, there is a level of change that can happen, but not so much in the structure, but more in the functioning at the circuit level aspect. And you can understand this briefly using this concept called the critical and the sensitive period. So just to remember briefly, critical period is what we call when there is a period of time in your first 1 to 1.5 years of age, right from the time of conception till this post-delivery 18 months, where certain skills have to get nurtured by the environment so that they start working. And it is this critical period in which they have to get initiated. And if they do not get initiated in this critical period, they may never ever get initiated at all. So one of the most commonest examples we give is the system of your retina to your visual cortex. So a lot of these children who right from the early birth, they are not properly given a lot of light stimulus or probably do not experience an adequate level of visual input, they may never develop a fully formed visual system. Now this is a critical period which is very brief, but then you have a much longer period called the sensitive period. A sensitive period is basically understood to be the level in which environment can actually have an impact in the brain. And the level or the magnitude of this impact reduces as the child is growing. So a sensitive period is a much longer period, and what current data tells us is right from the age of birth till about the age of 5 to even 7 years, Sometimes there is varying data for the sake, but what they're trying to tell us is the first 5 to 7 years in the life of the child where experience can have a maximum impact. And these changes which are learned in this particular age is much quicker in adapting or much faster in terms of integrating into the brain, much faster during the sensitive period than it would have an influence after the sensitive period has ended. So that's why learning a new language, learning any kind of a skill, learning any kind of a prodigious talent is much easier as a child and not so easy as an adult. You can still do it, but then the sensitive period has ended, so probably a subscription for faster learning has ended, so you're going to put a lot of effort there. So this is something which we need to remember once we are able to tap into these things and giving as much as more a richer experience for younger children using your design, using your toys. Keep the things in mind. Next slide. It's the graph to let you visualize the impact of various kind of brain functions. The graph basically represents the level of plasticity. So as you can see, areas such as the sensory areas like vision, touch, they reach the highest level of plasticity much earlier in the birth, but then the plasticity reduces as the age grows on. And the same thing applies to certain things like the capacity for implicit learning. Implicit learning are all your automatic habitual learning systems, like how you're going to jump, how you're going to swim, how you're going to ride your bike. All these things are much faster and earlier in your infancy to your toddler level. The neuroplasticity is the highest, and as the child grows, it's much lesser. Although on the other hand, if you look at the hippocampus is one of the areas in the brain which is very important for storing your memory, storing experiences. This is still good. A lot of good level of memory experiences, especially in your childhood, is much faster, and most of your childhood is remains highly plastic and highly malleable. And that's why a lot of your childhood memories stick, unfortunately also. But then as the person grows, the level of keeping these things very core into your memory, the level in which these can adapt and change slowly reduces. But as the age increases, your cognitive functions, which we're going to deal in terms of what are the neurocognitive domains, these things do get better and better over age, and after a point they reach something of a plateau. That's what you're going to try to understand from this graph. Next slide. So again, summarizing experiences and brain, there is clearly these experiences that has to be given in certain age, certain levels in the critical period and sensitive period, who directly is going to impact in how this child is going to express things like its language, its emotional capacity, its own development of its identity. Next slide. So just this graph that will go to represent the interaction between gene and the environment. In the critical period and spaces are basically the kinds of genes that actually help in your neuronal migration, and the kind of genes that are basically dependent on experience, and there are certain genes which are purely genetically determined. That's why there is a distinction called experience expected and then experience dependent. So this is just a graph to show how much of experience expectant kind of genetic material plays a role much earlier in life, and as you grow, certain genes which are very much experience dependent start taking a role. So just a little bit of those graphs. Next slide. I wanted to put this slide just for you to get familiar with certain terms that we'll be using for the rest of the presentation for the next part as well. So your brain's basic structure is something you all need to get familiar with, because you're all going to design something keeping all these areas in your head. So looking at the outer aspect of the brain, which we call as cortex. So distinctly every area in the cortex, as the child has grown into an adult, has become more and more specialized. It's almost like we're all growing up and we try to become more and more specialized, right? In kindergarten, we learn all subjects. We learn everything in the world, and right from 10th standard, we try to cover many subjects. But by now, when you're all in graduation and post-graduation, you're going to specialize and specialize. The same thing happens in your brain also. So if you're looking at certain areas, which is in the frontal area of your brain called the frontal lobe, which is very important. And this, if you look at the right side, there are 3 levels to this brain as well in the evolutionary aspect also. So the frontal lobe is considered the most human part of the brain. This is in fact by evolution, this is something which led to the differentiation of us from the chimpanzees, is the development of this frontal lobe. So this frontal lobe is probably the most advanced, and this is where all your speech, your executive functions, your unique fine motor skills, and all your unique memory, every kind of judgments, every kind of meaningful perceptions are all conveyed from your frontal lobes. And you look at other domains in your cortex, such as your parietal lobes is in the sides, which mainly deal with a little bit of your sensations and how your body understands sensory areas. And you look at the side aspect called your temporal lobe right here, where predominantly your understanding of language, as I'm speaking, it's all directly going and getting a meaning from your temporal lobe. And right from behind your head, this area is called your occipital lobe, which simply takes over about your visual aspect. And this little brain called the cerebellum, which integrates all your coordination. We briefly remember reading in your biology, I'm sure, coordination for motor is in cerebellum. Well, cerebellum does much, much more. It's in the responsible seat for coordinating, in fact, all kinds of your cognition as well. And then this part of the brain that we're trying to look on the right side is a three-part brain. So the most outer layer is your human brain, and then this is called as the cortex, right? So there is a layer just underneath the cortex, which is called a subcortical area. This subcortical area is very much similar to most of us and the mammals. Right? This area is what we call as the emotional center of the area, or your limbic system, which is your emotional system, is basically right here. And interestingly, this is all you need to understand. This mammalian brain is something which is very reactive. It's going to always react to all your anger, rage, all your cardinal pleasure impulses. All these come from here, and it's this human brain at the top which is trying to restrict and trying to put a full stop, or trying to put a gear system and a brake to regulate this. And much below this is what we have, your lizard brain or your brain stem. So the brain stem is the same level of capacity that we have, and that level is something which we can share with even the reptiles and even lower organisms, which are basically your reflex systems. These are your autonomic nervous systems that deal with your heartbeat, your digestion, your respiration. So this is something which you can all take home, at least from this end of this presentation, that your brain is so beautifully designed, and there is a design and architecture in this. And I'm sure, really hope that this inspires all of you designers to remember that there is one of the greatest designs that is already inside you and you're carrying it around. And something now you have to take as an inspiration to do some more. Next slide. So now we will have a basic integration of what are all the different domains. So now that we've understood there will be specialization in your brain, right? So we go into core areas of neurocognition per se. So we'll start from what we understand as higher cognitive functions, and this is something which you all need to learn so that you can tap into these domains. The kind of play designs that I or anyone here and the organizing committee are probably visualizing is, you can look at a kind of a functional play which are directly tapping into the utility of these cognitive domains, and by the virtue of this experience, this particular cognitive domain should improve for this child. So that's what we're trying to aim, and that's why I'm going to give a brief introduction into these basic neurocognitive domains. We'll start from the basic level. Next slide. The first and the most important neurocognitive domain, in fact, as psychiatrists, when we do assessments for higher cognitive functions, the first thing we assess is a person's capacity for attention. You're sleeping, you're half asleep, and you're attentive. So attention takes effort. With attention, only the other cognitive functions can actually play a role, right? And attention has these three levels that we can assess. The first capacity is something which comes from your reticular activating system, is the alert state. Like you're not asleep, you're all alive and you're like looking out and gathering information. That is the alert state. Then a little bit of attention is contributed towards orientation. By orientation, you know your time, your place, and who are all around you. That kind of a context is given from orientation. And then comes the higher level, which is your selection. Now you're alert and you're oriented, and you choose to put this attention, this camera of attention, into where you want to put and how you want to utilize this. And once this camera is set on something, the other cognitive domain starts coming and you start using them and you start taking advantage of those capacities. Next slide. So briefly looking at the kind of attentions that you can see and study, and also remember when you're designing these toys, is there are these 5 basic kinds of attention. Just to briefly remember, focused attention is something which capacity to stick to a particular stimulus, and you're able to orient and stay alert to one particular level of stimulus. Could be just the visual aspect or could be just the auditory aspect. That is your focused attention. By virtue of focused attention, you're filtering all the other irrelevant information at that point. Then comes your sustained attention. Now, sustained attention is more of the timeline in which your attention is. This is basically translated to sustained attention is same as the word concentration is. How long you can keep the attention on one particular aspect or one particular task at a stretch. Then there is the capacity for shifting attention. It's almost like I keep imagining attention to be a camera where your focus is right now here. You should also have enough flexibility to focus and defocus from one area to an refocus on something else. This capacity to defocus and refocus is called your shifting attention, and this it's in fact a important capacity for your attention. Selective attention is again very important. It's a little different from focused attention. The advanced level of focused attention is what we call as selective attention. Focused attention is like you have a particular aspect where you're like trying to focus. Selective attention directly means in the presence of other distractors, you're focusing. So that is like the little bit more nuanced usage of focused attention is your selective attention, where you're directly trying to inhibit yourself from paying attention to other things. Divided attention is your little bit of multitask, where you are having a little bit of attention thrown here and there, like especially when you're riding or you're driving. So you're looking at the road and you're also talking to your friend. That takes a little bit of divided attention. So I hope all these things were clear. If there is any doubt, we will deal with in the question session. Next slide. Now we go to the next and probably my most favorite cognitive domain here. This is your executive function, right? The word executive function literally translates to your capacity of this neurocognitive domain to execute work. So by virtue of by executing work, all your executive domains are probably one of the most advanced cognitive skill sets which are very unique to humans. Very few species have as much of executive functions that we have. So what entails these executive functions? There are these three foundational executive functions through which the other levels, the higher executive functions develop. And overall, there are almost 10 executive functions. In fact, there are more than 10 because there are different criteria to assess executive functions. So there are many terminologies here, but these are the basic ones. The first one here is what we call as the working memory. The word memory, I'm sure many of you know, is like you take into account some information, you store that information and you recall, right? That's basically what memory is defined as. Now, memory can be divided into three types, right? One, something called as the immediate memory, right? Let's say you look at something on the road and there was a shop, and then you're looking at the shop name, and in a few seconds your friends going to ask what was the shop name you just saw, and you're going to say it. So it's your immediate recall. And there is something called as your recent memory. Let's say your mom asks you, where did you go out yesterday? It was just 24 hours ago. You probably remember that, or you're immediately saying it. It just comes to you. Now, the other one is your remote memory or your long-term memory, where I remember saying the word hippocampus, the part of the brain where that gets stored, is something which all your autobiographical memories, all your life events are all stored in a sequence, and there is a timeline, and suddenly you have a personality, right? So why am I saying this? Working memory specifically is relating to your immediate and recent memory. It's like your immediate random access memory that you have. It's almost like your phone's RAM. So basically, how quick you're able to store immediately available information temporarily but efficient enough so that you're quickly able to manipulate it. That is your working memory. As you're talking to someone, you're going to note some phone numbers. That's your working memory. As you're walking by, you're immediately noting there is a tree that is coming up. But you still have to dodge that and then move. Assume that is working memory. So working memory can be two things. It can be verbal and it can be visuospatial, as I just pointed out through these examples. So that is one of your basic level of executive function. Second thing is like almost your gear system with a brake. This is your inhibitory control. As we just saw in your last slide, attention is something which is a capacity that is constantly bombarded with a lot of demand. Like your attention always requires a superior control on it. So attention is your most basic cognitive function, but then above which is your executive function, and mainly your inhibitory executive function that plays a role in keeping this in check. So inhibition can be two kinds of inhibition. Inhibition can be not only your attention or your cognitive aspect. Inhibition is also your motor or body aspect. Let's say you just have this urge to cough, and you're not in a scenario where people would take it in a very gracious manner. There is a part of you that is controlling the motor aspect as well. That again is an executive function of inhibitory control. So basically what inhibitory control does is puts a brake in any of our actions so that any person who does not have enough impulse, enough inhibitory control is someone who's a lot of impulsivity in their nature, right? So inhibitory control is basically how you are able to stop yourself from something or even resist yourself from other demanding attention. And lastly, the cognitive flexibility is basically your capacity to handle different rules in life. Every day, every time you're working or doing whatever it is, there is a set of rules that you have to adhere to, right? When I'm walking, I have to walk like this. There is a rule for walking. You've learned it as a child, and it's still working. When you're driving, there's a rule. When you're talking, there's a rule. Set shifting or your mental flexibility is basically keeping all these rules in the mind and knowing when to switch. So cognitive flexibility is something which is a higher level of executive functioning. Someone who has a very good cognitive flexibility can adapt much more easier in any kind of environment because they're quickly able to change the rules in their functioning and adapt according to the rules that are demanded in that situation. Now, executive function, what is the basic need of us having executive function? One of my favorite doctors whose biggest specialty is ADHD, his name is Dr. Russell Barkley. He keeps saying there is an important need to have this word called self-regulation in daily usage. Self-regulation is your capacity to channelize all your action with a future-oriented goal. And by virtue of this definition, an executive function in your brain works directly towards self-regulation. So that is why we have executive functioning capacities in our brain. And these core executive functionings will work together in higher order to have higher order executive functionings like your reasoning, problem solving, planning, etc. Right? Next slide. So we'll touch upon language development, which is an important neurocognitive domain. Very interestingly, language is to be seen in these domains. There is a sound aspect of it. There is a meaning aspect of it. Here also there is a grammatical or the rules aspect of it, and there is a pragmatic aspect of it. What is pragmatic? Pragmatic is when and how best to use language. Every child right from birth is going to start with gaga goo, right? There are not much semantic aspects to it. And then slowly by the time the child is 1 year, is able to say mama, papa. There is a semantic aspect, there's a meaning to it. And slowly by the time this child is 2 years, is going to add a sentence structure to it. Amma wa, mummy de do mujhe, godi karo mujhe. So there is a structure, it's following a rule here. And then slowly by the time the child is 2.5, the child is able to call a person by its name. There is a utility in the social aspect for this language. So this is what I mean by phonological, semantic, grammatic, and pragmatic aspects. And every child is born with something called as the innate language acquisition device. There is a genetic aspect to it. There is an inner architecture which is waiting to get molded. So the experience starts molding it. So that's why culture, experience all play a huge role in how language develops. And I think next slide would be helpful here. Next slide. So yeah, this may look like a very complex slide, but it's actually simple. So by inside and outside, what I mean is the inside is the genetic aspect or the inner workings of the brain that is contributing to the language development. And outside is obviously your society or the environment. And you can see how beautifully everything comes together to shape someone's language. So language is one of the higher cognitive levels. We started from something as simple as just attention. Then we went into something as sophisticated as executive functioning. Now we're getting into something which is as supreme as language. So by language, the inner workings require what? You need a good sensory system. So the perception has to play a role. You need a good attention, obviously, and a good executive function because they are right at the base to channelize all your attention and all your targeted goal behavior so that you get into those experiences. And as you're experiencing the social interaction, your language is slowly getting shaped up with all these multiple influences. And this goes through a set of milestones. Next slide. Now we go into probably one of the highest level of neurocognitive domain called the memory. You are what your memory is. You know what happens in dementia? I'm just taking a little bit of a detour so that you can get the significance of this. One of the things that we experience when we're dealing with patients of dementia is the person who, we're talking about extreme cases, not the mild ones, extreme Alzheimer's dementia. This is the person who's lost all his autobiographical memory. Now, suddenly, if you wake up one day and you don't have any autobiographical memory, you don't have a story, right? What is your story here? You don't know. You just woke up and you're just reacting. You're suddenly a baby again. You're again that 2 months old child who's just reacting to light and you're trying to make sense of everything. So that's why memory is given that much importance, because every memory is so beautifully sequentially stored, and so many kinds of these memory are utilized to make who you are. Your entire personality is defined by your memory. So this memory can be, now coming back to the topic, is divided into these two aspects. I've touched a little bit about the timelines in terms of the immediate, the recent, and the long-term memory. In terms of utility, the long-term memory alone can be divided into two things, called the explicit long-term memory and the implicit long-term memory. So the explicit memory is basically what we learn in terms of a daily usable fact. So your language could be an explicit memory. So that's why the word semantic, basically the kind of meanings you attribute. A lot of your temporal lobe plays a role. And this happens much later in life, very advanced level of semantic learning. And obviously the episodic. The timeline and the sequence of events in your life are all stored in this form of episodic memory. Again, a very explicit fact-based memory, which is going to evolve involving both your temporal and frontal lobe right from your childhood. On the other hand, you have something which is implicit. This is not a fact based memory. It's not a meaning, it's not an event. These are basically your inherent automatic skill sets. And they can be as simple as a procedural. Procedural is like, you know how to get down the stairs, right? You don't think every time how to get down. But a person who has a stroke in their basal ganglia will suddenly forget how to get down the stairs. So that's why this part is very important. It's going to be stored in your striatum. Striatum is basically in your, you remember when I talked about cortex, the underlayer of the cortex is called the subcortex. Somewhere there you have a structure called striatum. And that is where all your procedural learning takes over. And because this is so protected inside, the beauty is any damage or any kind of stroke that can damage your outer areas of the brain will not immediately affect your inner areas of the brain. So that causes the persons, even after a stroke, they still have a very good procedural memory. A person may forget what his name was, but he will still know how to wash his hands, eat, or ride a car. So that is your procedural memory, which is not a fact based, it's very implicit and very much a activity based thing. And same applies to all your reactionary responses. A player who's a sports person remembers specific reflexes. When he sees the ball, he knows how to time the shots. All these things are your implicit memories. And a lot of your cerebellum, amygdala, all your reflex systems take over here, and to ensure that these things are trained deeply. And priming. Priming is a very interesting aspect. Priming is something which is actually a fact-based memory, but you still don't have complete words to it. You only have images to it. You just have brief perceptions such as a smell or a vision or some kind of a sound that is familiar to you, but you don't know very clearly about it. Those things are actually quite implicitly stored in your neocortex, and they're actually understood to be your implicit contributory memories. So I hope the memory aspect is touched. And the short term something is we did discuss when we were discussing the memory aspects was basically your working memory and your executive function. That is covered in your short term memory. Next slide. I had to put this graph. So the memory is probably one of the highest systems of neurocognition. So it takes a lot of time for this system to be constructed and to start functioning. And that's why none of you here remember anything that happened when you were 1 or 2 or even at best 3 years old. I've met some kids who do remember things right from their 3 years. And I have never, and I'm sure I will probably never meet any person who remembers what happened to them when they were 6 months or 1 month, because the memory system is not yet in place. So that aspect of your life where you do not have a memory system in place, where all your responses are just reactionary and you don't remember anything, and it goes on till even the age of around 3 and a half. That period is called your childhood or infantile amnesia. And beautifully, by the age of around 3 and a half, your brain has now become quite sophisticated because it has crossed all the levels. It has started from a simple attention system, it has developed the executive functioning, it has developed a good language, and then this language is your rate limiting step here. As soon as a person develops a good language, you know how easy it is to code a person's memory using language, right? So the child who has now started developing language is able to sequentially code the life events using this language. And as soon as language starts developing, memory systems starts evolving. So that's why there is a lag. And as soon as the child is now 3 to 4 years, the memory systems take over. Now the child is going to remember who's my father, where do I go to school, and everything. Okay. So this is a very interesting graph, which always, makes me happy when I explain. Next slide. Okay, and obviously now we reach the more highest and probably the nuanced level of neurocognition, which is now all your systems are in place, right? Your attention, your executive functions are in place, your language and memory systems are now slowly evolving, which means you are now ready to learn. And this learning, in the most basic psychological aspect or understanding of it, is two kinds. It's a habitual learning or an associative learning. Habitual learning is something you do again and again and again, and you get good at it. Associative learning is something which is directly influenced by your environmental responses. So every time there is a new information, it is paired with some other existing information, and a learning takes place. So that's why this is somewhere related to your implicit and explicit memory as well. Most of your implicit memories come through habituations by just repetition. You did not read a book to know how to ride a cycle, right? You just rode it again and again, and then you've learned to ride a cycle. So that's habituation based learning, and that happens through repetition. Now, the learnings otherwise, in fact, most of the learning happens through the other broad category called associative learning. So you're here, you're sitting with a lecture, you know you are participating in this amazing competition by IIT, and that's giving context to it. And you're listening to this man who's rambling on about this entire plethora of neurocognition. You're trying to associate all these things and you're trying to gather some information. So this is how associative learning happens. And at the core, associative learning can be further divided into two to three kinds. I'm sure all of you have heard to some level this word called uh, Pavlov's dog or Pavlov's response. It's called classical conditioning. It's one of the most basic level of associative learning. So your body, all of us have a nervous system which is quite reactionary. If someone's going to throw a ball at you, your immediate reaction is to just move, right? If someone's going to tell you that there is a bad news coming up, your heart's going to start pounding, right? You're going to see a delicious dessert in front of you. Your sweat glands, I'm sorry, your salivary glands are going to get activated. So your body responds to certain stimulus, and then over time, that stimulus gets associated with another experience. So your body learns to respond to that newer stimulus also, and that is basically your classical conditioning, right? The simplest example is something like the Pavlov's dog. So what Pavlov did was every day there was an experience where he would give a fresh cut meat to the dog would salivate, and every time the dog is allowed to salivate and see the meat, he would also ring the bell. And over time, there's an association between the bell and the meat. So after a point, you didn't have to even show the meat at all. All you had to do was just ring the bell and the dog would salivate. So this happens to most of us when we are learning from fear, learning from any kind of trauma. Like some other related experiences will trigger that same fear reaction to you. All this is classical conditioning, right? Operant conditioning is something which someone learns to associate a memory due to something which is a consequence of an event. So if I do a lot of good hard work and I get a good mark, my mom's going to give me a lot of appreciation, hugs and kisses. So the consequence is something which now I register and I keep doing it again and again. And that is a kind of learning that happens because of the consequence called as operant conditioning. And the most basic and the most common thing is the social learning. You don't have to do anything. You just look at a person doing something and you yourself are able to do it just by looking at the person. Right? You see how a person gets applauded because he has accomplished something and you assume, okay, if I do that, I'll also get applauded. That's basically social learning. So this is just a run through of the basic kinds of learning. Next slide. And finally, we come to the most advanced of all the cognitive domains, which is your social cognition. And I have to spend some time with this slide because social cognition is to date the most complex of all the neurocognitive domains because this is exactly what makes us a fully functioning human brain. A human brain who does not have a good level of social cognition is still a artificial intelligent robot. Isn't that the only difference between us and robot, right? This, what you're looking at your screen, is perhaps the only difference between a robot and us. Everything which I've spoken so far is present in a robot as well. I think somewhere here I've read the news that there is a new robot called Optimus released, and it's scary, right? Probably Optimus is going to learn a lot using these social cognition domains here that they have spoken. Social cognition differentiates us from a robot because social cognition is what gives meaning and context to all of interactions. right? It starts from something as simple as face processing. I think you can just run the slide because I've kept an animation here which will highlight every domain that I'm touching. So when I say next, you just press, it'll get highlighted. So yeah, next slide. So face processing, yeah, you can highlight all of it, no issues. I'll just cover one of them. So starting from face processing, the first and the most primary level that this starts is how a child, I'm talking about a neonate who is just around 1 to 1.5 months here. There is an inherent capacity of this neonate to look at the patterns in which your face is arranged. It can there are now beautiful clear cut evidences just so fascinating that says that this neonate can have a longer gaze towards this structure called two eyes and this dot called mouth. It is recognizing that there is an innate need for it to pay more attention to that. This attention bias, which what I mean by attention bias is basically this small neonate pays a longer attention to that face than the other stimulus around it. This attention bias towards the face like stimuli. By face like, you don't even have to have a full face, you just have to have these three dots. There is an inherent system that gets activated from that point as a human baby is born, which is going to pay more attention to a face like stimuli. And slowly, as this baby is growing, it is going to understand and discriminate faces, and it's going to absorb information how people with different faces will interact with it. And then the more sophisticated level of facial expression. This is so important because there are so many muscles in your face. The facial muscles was one of the most toughest topics during MBBS days because there are so many of it, and all these muscles have a meaning in the way they are going to arrange. It's fascinating how you look at a person's snigger or a person just give a grin. All of it is basically just your muscles arranging themselves in different proportions in different strengths, and there is a meaning to this. This meaning is attributed to some kind of an emotion there. This is something which a child learns right from infancy. So basic social referencing, which is what my mom's face looks like when my mom is happy, what my brother's face looks like when he's mad. And that pattern starts registering, and the child is going to use it. It's going to match, it's going to label, and it's going to start using these facial expressions over time. And this all starts happening right from infancy. And then you go to the good stuff called the empathy. You are at a level where this child is slowly going on to attribute meanings for everyone's action. It's not just a facial expression. It's going to look at a person uh, trying to play with a toy and see that this person is so happy, and there is a meaning to this. So this child is immediately going to remember and learn just by observing and attributing that if I had that toy, I would probably be just as happy as that kid, and it's going to throw a tantrum. I want that toy. All this happens so fast. This child has learned to empathize, put itself in someone else's shoes, and gather meaning. So the child is now able to remember the good experiences from bad experiences by learning from other people's experiences. So this empathy is now taking over. And now all these things right from your infancy start slowly taking shape. And then it's only around this higher level where we look at things like joint attention, we're looking at things like theory of mind. Theory of mind is probably the highest level of empathy, where you're exactly attributing what a person is thinking just by looking at what are their behaviors. So if someone is mad, you're actually having thoughts to even give some kind of a meaning to these are probably what this person is thinking when they are mad, right? That capacity is called theory of mind or TOM. It starts coming up late in infancy as the child is growing up. And the reason why I'm putting a lot of time in these things is one of the conditions that we'll read today called autism. Autism has a lot of problem in theory of mind. It has a lot of problem in joint attention. Those are areas of development which is still not taken over. They've still not started, slowly developing into other higher nuances. So you need to come up with ideas to give these children of neurodiversity, especially these autism, has certain experience where this theory of mind slowly gets kindled, slowly gets activated. So this is something which why I'm spending a lot of time, and hopefully you try to gather a little bit more insight into these things. And as the child in the highest level, what makes us all human is we have something called morality. No other species has that. Empathy, yes, chimpanzees do have empathy. Theory of mind, pretty much. Many of your primates have this level of social cognition too. Moral reasoning is something which only humans are, probably from whatever we have collected data and even understood from whatever our own frameworks are. We believe that moral reasoning is something which is very unique to humans. We have a value system that is conveyed into our meanings and says that something is right and something is wrong. And that starts from infancy. And this is one of the highest level of social cognition. And there are even stages for this moral development, which is outside the purview of this conversation or this discussion we are having. Okay, next slide. So now that we have just run through all of these advanced level of neurocognitive domains, right from something as basic as attention to very sophisticated executive functioning, that leads to very vital step of developing of language, which leads to one of the most advanced systems called memory, and that memory will slowly make you get into something called as learning all your social cognitions and all your meanings and everything. All that is learned, and this is your cognitive aspect of it. Now we just have to little bit address the other parts of your brain as well. So far we only talked about this one part which is inside your head called the brain. Now there is something called the brain being connected to the rest of the body, right? That rest of the body is also important for us to show how experiences actually shape how your body and your brain are associated. And this process is what we understand in a very simplest language called sensory processing and sensory integration. You all have lots of sensory systems at play. What is a sensory system? The basic definition is how you relate to your environment is through a systems or different systems called sensory organs. Right? Next slide. We'll just go into a little bit of detail on this. Okay. Your brain is going to receive information from the environment through your entire body, which is full of various kinds of sensory systems which are in place to collect all that information, transmit it to the brain, and then the brain does the simple job of giving a meaning to it. All your brain does is sit and decrypt, sit and give meaning to it, sit and make sense of everything. But then everything that is sensed comes from your entire body. You have so many systems that are actively 24 into 7 functioning to continuously collect and gather all this information. Next slide. And these are all your sensory systems. The understanding here is we have divided them based on actual physiology here. Anyone who is a specialist in physiology would be the best person to explain how each of these systems actually take place. There's a lot of chemical to electrical conversion. There is sound vibration to electrical conversion. There is so much of this magnificent physiology that happens. All that gets converted into an electrical signal, goes through the neurons, enters the various synapses, and reaches the cortex, and your brain gives a meaning to it. Right? It could come from vision, your sight. It could come from taste, your gustatory reflexes called your taste. It could come from auditory, sound. It could come from touch or your tactile, smell. The other three words is something which may not be familiar with. The vestibular is basically, let's say, you're closing your eyes and you're just sitting back and you're resting your back on a very flimsy chair, which is a little bit shaky, and your friend comes over and tips it off. As you tip over, don't you feel a jolting reflex that alerts you that your body's balance is somewhere lost, and you try to get back to that balance? See, that is your vestibular system communicating that information to you, right? And then there is proprioception. How do you understand proprioception? You're going to drive. Let's say you're driving, and as you're driving, you don't always look at what you're doing, right? You're just looking at the road and you're going to pull the seat belt without looking, and you know exactly where the side of your hip is. You're aware where each and every part of your body is without having to look at that, right? Let's say even someone who's playing a sport, or let's say someone who's dancing, they don't really have to see and get the mind feedback of knowing where their legs or arms are going. They just know, right? That is your proprioception. And it's the highest in people who are kinesthetically very active, like people who are athletes and performers, and all those people have very high sense of proprioception. They know where their body is, right? And lastly, the interoception is basically sensations coming from within the body, right? Someone has a palpitation, it doesn't feel good. Someone has a gastric upset, it doesn't feel good. Someone feels very good when they are very much in an intimate situation, it feels good. And that are all kinds of your interoceptive sensations that come from within the body. These are all your sensory systems which are throughout the body, distributed based on these sensory receptors, are constantly transmitting physiological information, converting them to electrical signals, sending them to your brain so that your brain, in all of this in micro, just as smallest units of seconds as possible, are immediately decoded and conveyed to you with a meaning. Next slide. So there are three that are normally important for keeping all your sensory systems in check. So there are these capacities which are still not fully understood as to which area of the brain is fully attributing all these functions, but we know that these functions are there because we can through psychological experiments understand that this aspect of sensory issues is not there. So we have come to the conclusion that these processes exist in the brain. Firstly, we have something called the modulation of senses. Basically, as I said, 24 into 7, all of your bodies, all of your sensory systems are actively collecting information, isn't it? So it's so easy for us to just get overwhelmed, right? And there is a reason why there is a part of the brain which we still fully don't understand. There is a circuit that is actively taking over and ensuring that all the sensory information is modulated. You don't have to completely process every one of them every single time. All I have to right now in this very moment, all of you pretty much are now focused only on your auditory and your visual senses because you're just listening to this lecture. You're probably not so much tuned into the temperature around you. You're probably not too much tuned into where your body position is as you're sitting. So this is basically your sensory modulation that is taking place. And yes, the reason why we are talking about this is there could be situations where your sensory modulation is not really active. There are conditions which are there in children with developmental delays, which actually results in poor modulation, so that so many of these sensory environments can create a chaos, can create an unbalanced sensory experience for these children, and they unfortunately react to it in a very difficult way. So modulation is necessary. Discrimination is very straightforward. You obviously need to differentiate the different ways. These are almost 8 kinds of sensations, right? And you need to know there are 8 kinds because you're able to discriminate them. That capacity is not there in some people. A lot of times, discrimination issues can happen after stroke or after any kind of neurological illnesses. So some sensations are gone, and obviously, sensory integration is more of the higher cognitive aspect of it, where you're looking at the environment and you're creating a cohesive meaning based on the level of these senses, right? I go to Shimla and say there is a pleasant weather. What has happened here? You've actually done a lot of sensory integration. You've understood that there is a right level of temperature, the right level of touch in your body, the right level of smell that comes from the breeze. There's a right level of light and vision. There is everything which is in the right proportion. It is all coming together and gives you a clear-cut understanding of this is how Shimla feels like. That is your sensory integration, how your last level of processing that takes place. And a lot of times, like I said, children who have developmental disorders also tend to have poor sensory integration, which leads to a lot of their sensory integration deficits. Next slide. So the word sensory processing is just something which I was just trying to come to is all these experiences come inside. A lot of these experiences are irrelevant. Some of these experiences are relevant, and the way in which something is important or not is decided by the situation, the context, the environment. All this is basically done through the sensory modulation, discrimination, and integration. And this entire process is called sensory processing, right? As simple as it sounds. And there is a problem sometimes in children who have developmental delays, commonly children with autism. And in fact, any children with any kind of developmental delay can have a sensory processing disorder. And the truth is, all of us have a sensory processing issue as a child. Most of us have a particular preference for the temperature in the AC. Most of us have a preference for the kind of fabric that we want to use. most of us have a preference for the kind of incense stick that you want to buy, right? There is a preference. Now, this preference happens over experiences that have been processed over time. And finally, there is an optimal level which has been decided by your brain, obviously. And now you know where your comfort zones lie. Now, this capacity to finally come to that optimal conclusion of what my sensory limits are is something which we have done effortlessly. But unfortunately, there are these children who have these developmental delays who are not able to do this effortlessly, and they do require training and effort for this. And when they do not have these capacities, we can even have a diagnosis called sensory processing disorder, and they require a lot of separate therapies for the same. Next slide. So now we've come to the final crux of our presentation today, the last probably 10 minutes, I think. So we've understood what it is to have a brain in the first place, the amount of miracle that has happened for this brain to exist, and the kind of fascinating things that this brain does in terms of neurocognitive functions and all those things, and all the sensory aspects also. So we now try to understand the fact that all of us, like I said, have a very unique genetic system. All of us have a very unique environment in which our genetic systems have, you know, integrated and connected or interacted with, which leads to a unique combination for each and every one of us. Each and every one of us have a different individual experience as to our neural capacities. These differences may be very subtle, because predominantly most of us have the same domains which are classified as basic human capacities, right? But then there are these unique differences. There are differences in ways some of us have attention capacity. There are differences in the way some of us have social cognition. There are differences in ways some people are more skilled in their language than others. There is a difference in ways some people are more athletic than others. All these differences have a variation, right? And this variation is going to be very, very common across all of us. And the fact that some of these variations can lead to a level where some people are probably more deprived than others. Some people are more language deprived than others. Some people, by development, by virtue of their unfortunate gene and environment interaction, are more social cognition deprived than others. Some people have lesser athletic abilities. So we need to remember the problems that can arise from all these issues may look bad, may cause disabilities or impairments. But what we are trying to do here is to respect them, because they are still a variation that has happened because of your environment and your nature coming into your own unique interaction, right? And for this, we have a word called neurodiversity. Firstly, next slide. So yeah, I just talked about these individual differences that all of us do have. There are so many things that are coming together, so many different combinations of experiences and inherent genetic capacities, all having so many permutations and combinations in the level in which each of us have our cognitive capacities. So accept that there will be individual differences for all, and it's a fact of life. But if it is going to lead to a problem, unfortunately, there is a social stigma related to it. If it's a child who is going to be born with a certain developmental delay, let's say the child has poor language and social development, obviously this is a child who's not going to really have a capacity to connect with others, or probably does have a capacity to connect but may not express the connection it wants to share, right? And that child is going to look very, very different from the majority. And there's an inherent human nature that all of us have to classify someone as normal, someone as abnormal. And the moment you classify someone as abnormal, the problem starts right there. Our inherent nature is to divide as humans. Our inherent nature is to categorize. Our inherent nature is also to choose, to prioritize who gets more and who gets less. And this inherent nature leads to a lot of problem. And the simplest of all those problems to understand is social stigma towards people who have a lot of neurological deficits because of their individual differences. And that is why, next slide,
We have this sociological movement that happened in the early 90s, interestingly by a sociologist called Jody Singer, who gave this beautiful term called neurodiversity. What we're trying to convey through neurodiversity is, dude, like a forest, every forest has different kinds of trees, right? So this is nature and environment interacting for every one of us, which means there will be a lot of individual differences, and some people might have uh, the bad end of the spectrum, right? Some people might have much more deficits, which is going to make them incapacitated to compete with the majority, right? Let's not give them a discrimination. Let's not give them a lot of stigma to fight. Let's accept them as a normal variations that has happened in their gene and environment interaction. So that word of neurodiversity conveys that meaning that just like how neural brains can have different kinds of developmental levels, the expression is going to be quite diverse. And by using the word neurodiverse, you're actually accepting all these differences, some of these extreme differences that can come up, and some of these differences can even get a diagnostic label. Diagnostic label is the business of the doctors, but unfortunately, it also carries a social stigma. So, this movement called neurodiversity tries to address that stigma by calling all this as a probable normal variations, some of the variations just as too extreme, causing problems, right? So that is why the word neurodiversity has a lot of social connotation when we use. Next slide. So now we'll just briefly run through basic neurodiverse conditions. The condition which most of you here probably are by now familiar is autism. In the simplest words, autism is basically a child who is not yet fully developed as per expected level its language and social capacities. It's leading to the child having poor verbal skills, poor social skills, and because of that, it is going to have poor interpersonal relationships and peer relationships. And like many developmental disorders, primarily even in autism, sensory issues are also there. Its sensory systems are not fully integrated. The child is not able to have what we thought as empathy, the capacity to quickly empathize, capacity to quickly look at someone else and take a social referencing, and the capacity to have a theory of mind, to understand probably what this person is thinking is something which is not easily and natural for a child because of its social and language deficits, which leads to a lot of these problems where the child has to figure out everything on its own. It's so easy for us when some of our friends, come to us and say, "Did you try the cupcake from that place? It tastes really good." We probably are able to imagine how good it must have felt. It's not so easy for a person with autism. They're not able to relate to your experience because it's so difficult. They have to rely on their own experience, which makes them quite rigid and quite fixated on the things they do. So they're going to show a lot of these repetitive behaviors because they stick to what they know, they stick to what comforts them, and they like to do it again and again because it's fun. But that's the only thing that feels comfortable to be, experiencing, and that leads to a lot of restricted interest in their behaviors. And all these things put together create this syndrome, this cluster of symptoms, which is often recognized and labeled as autism spectrum disorder. The word spectrum literally means that there is a variation in the level of deficits. Some people have mild deficits, some children are very severe in that deficit. So that's why there is a spectrum to it. Next slide. The most overdiagnosed, at the same time, the most underdiagnosed condition in all of neurodevelopment is your attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So I'll just quickly try to bust some myths here. Literally, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a developmental disorder, which means now that you've all understood what I talked about when we discussed the neurocognition, this is a child who has a very poor executive capacity. The child's attention, the child's executive systems like working memory, inhibition, the capacity to stop itself, the child's capacity to plan, the child's capacity to cognitively be flexible, all that is not properly developed. And again, this is also a spectrum. If you could understand all developmental disorders, there's a spectrum to this. So children with ADHD, the label ADHD is like a misnomer. It is not just the attention deficit, it's basically an executive deficit. It's a problem of self-regulation. The child is not fully in tune with their goal directed activity. There's a lot of processing errors there. There's a lot of problems when it comes to completing a task or executing some work. And this condition leads to things that you've seen here, all the symptoms of uninhibited talking, excessive talking, impulsivity, uninhibited motor activity, always on the move, lot of daydreaming, uninhibited, unhinged attention because your attention to select your attention and resist other is very poor. So you're going to always dream about things. And interestingly, the reason why I wanted to spend more time in ADHD is there is a very less awareness about what entails ADHD. When we call someone as ADHD, what we are psychiatrists or developmental pediatricians are going to assess is, did you have these executive deficits right from childhood? It's only then we can consider that to be a developmental issue in your executive function, and then we can give the label of ADHD. But then any person can have their attention or executive functions impaired temporarily. That is not ADHD. Person who's depressed is not going to use their attention skills to the max because their mood is probably in a very, very bad situation right now. All your energy levels are very poor because of depression. So you're not really going to show attention capacity. That doesn't mean you have ADHD. So there are so many situations which may mimic ADHD, which an expert has to assess and then assign the right diagnosis. Next slide. Specific learning disorder is a very interesting one, which is very, very poorly recognized. When we talk about specific learning disorder, we're looking at people who have good intelligence, who are probably having their entire capacity to learn, use their memory and experiences pretty good. Their only problem is more of a processing issue when it comes to language, right? Most of these children do not have a proper way to relate to sounds and symbols, which leads to poor learning, which leads to poor fluency when they're trying to read text, or their problems when they're trying to write, mistakes when they try to arrange a sentence and say. So the different entities that come under specific learning disorder is what you can see in the picture here. So the issues when it comes to especially reading is what you call as your dyslexia. Capacities which leads to problems in your calculation is dyscalculia, or writing is your dysgraphia, and all those things. But basically, what it entails is a person who has a very good intelligence but has issues processing language and symbols and sounds, causing poor capacity to read in your school level capacity competency. That is when you give the label of specific learning disorder. It's a very, very underdiagnosed neurodiverse condition. So these are children who really require a lot of training and therapy in sound processing, symbolic decoding, language capacities. So those things are very useful for these children with specific learning disorder, which I would normally would abbreviate as SLD. When I'm addressing SLD, I'm literally talking about specific learning disorder. Next slide. And the other developmental disorder, which is very recently understood, probably in the last 2 decades or so, is called a developmental coordination disorder. So most of the developmental disorders now, by now you've understood, like we saw so many of these neurocognitive domains, right? Basically, when we talk about a developmental disorder, we're talking about either of these domains or most of these domains not fully being developed as per the expected age. So that's what we mean by a developmental disorder. So when it comes to developmental coordination disorder, it's that fine motor and gross motor milestones not up to the mark. So these are children who, despite reaching a particular age, where you're expecting them to show a certain level of fine motor skills. Like by 9 months, you're going to expect a child to have something called a immature pincer grasp. Let's say if I have a pen here, by 9 to 10 months, I'm able to hold it like this. That's the simplest level of fine motor milestone which I'm going to assess in a baby. And as soon as the child is growing, 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 by the time I'm 1.5 years to 2 years, I'm going to hold it like this. This is called as the mature pincer grasp. So there is even a milestones for even your motor capacity. Now there are problems when this milestones in motor area are not fully developed, and that's going to lead to a diagnosis called developmental coordination disorder. These children can be clumsy, they do not have poor coordination, they may have problem in coordinating their movements, negotiating to spaces, so all those things, right? So next slide. Yeah, so that actually wraps up our first part of our presentation. That we have dealt with the four main agendas, which is to understand what is neurodevelopment. We have understood the basic neurocognitive domains from the developmental lens that we have been seeing, and note on sensory integration. And we briefly peeped into those developmental disorders that we would be expecting when we are trying to create an inclusive design for these children. So with that, I invite any questions, any clarifications from participants.
So, sir, there have been a few questions in the chat. Can we answer those first?
Let me just. Yeah, I think there's a question which I'm able to see. Could you point out which is the first question here? I'm just browsing back on the chat because I just opened the
Yes,
chat.
sure. I'll just read out the questions once.
Yeah, I think that'll be easier for me. Just read out the question, so I think I can just answer them.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first question is, any mental trauma that someone has, which part is affected, sensitive or critical?
Okay. Hope you've listened to this lecture pretty well. Trauma as an experience is something which is directly going to influence your emotions, right? And we talked about three levels of brain. We talked about your cortex, the outer part. We talked about your limbic system, which is your subcortical part. And this limbic system is where you have something called amygdala, which is your most important system for immediate emotional processing, right? When we use the word trauma, the meaning of trauma, the definition of trauma is any kind of a life-threatening situation or any situation where you felt unsafe or completely felt that you've been violated, and all these things. So there is an intense emotional thing that is endured during this process. So what happens in your brain is any kind of traumatic experiences when your emotions take over. I, I I have to take a little deeper. If you've seen the movie Inside Out, I think you will be able to relate, right? So when your amygdala takes over in your intense emotional situation, your cortex and your amygdala are now no more friends. So what happens is in those moments when someone is experiencing trauma, there is actually a hijack of your brain or your cortical area by your underlying limbic system or your mammalian brain. So those are moments when someone's entire cortical system collapses. But that's a temporary response because it doesn't mean your brain is damaged. It is just that for that moment of your time when you're experiencing trauma, or when because of your memory is now encoded with the traumatic memory, you're going to experience it again and again. Whenever you're going to experience these post traumatic symptoms or your anxiety symptoms, your emotional brain will take over your cortex. And by virtue, if your cortex is taken over, all of your executive functions are going to go for a toss. But that's a temporary difference. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, so next question. How does neuroplasticity differ in neurodivergent child compared to neurotypical?
Neuroplasticity by virtue is going to indicate the capacity of your brains to learn and adapt according to the environment. Now, you're obviously looking at a child who has some level of developmental delays. Now, this is a child whose genetic makeup is also not as efficient as the majority to gather those experiences and come out with that level of development in the milestone. So yes, there is going to be a problem even in neuroplasticity for the child, but that does not mean this child cannot learn. This is why we need to give training. We need to give behavioral interventions because you actually have to give more intensive environmental exposure to these children so that their level of neuroplasticity is still utilized for their learning, for their improvement, for their newer skill acquisitions. So yes, there is going to be a difference, but that is what we are going to try and make up by treatment modalities.
Okay, thank you, sir. How can one understand the levels of neurodivergence of any particular neurodevelopmental disorder? Does it have any spectrum? And how can we identify it and see the progress from different kinds of therapies?
This is basically what a child psychiatrist trains for. You have a method to it, you have scales, you have experience based learning, then you have to have clinical judgment. So you assess, then yes, there is going to be a difference in terms of how severe is one child's issue. Someone's ADHD can be much, much lesser in terms of severity compared to someone else. Someone's severity of autism in terms of rating, in terms of clinical assessments, is going to show a higher level of deficits than someone else. Yes, the way to know that is, I think, to keep it short, it is something that you train for and you actually have to have the expertise for.
What are the neurodevelopmental disorders in slow learners? Which aspects have to be focused for enhancing their learning ability?
So I think maybe I would try to keep it under my understanding. Slow learners, I think, is something which you can use for anyone who's probably not doing well at school or someone who's probably not achieving the milestones on time. So it could be a very broad meaning to it. So maybe there are two ways to explain this. The first thing I would try to explain you the condition called intellectual disability. So here we are actually looking at, see, there are milestones that we have talked about, right? There are language milestones, there are steps, and that there are phases through which the child develops capacities for language. And similarly, there are milestones for motor, milestones for social, milestones for their executive functions, all these things. A slow learner, if we're talking about an intellectual disability, is someone who has, compared to the majority, are achieving these milestones at a slower rate. So we expect, for example, we expect a child to walk by around 1 year to 14 months, let's say just after the birth. A person with intellectual disability can probably start walking by 2 years, despite the same exposure and everything. So that again is a kind of a neurodivergent condition, probably intellectual disability. At the same time, a person of slow learner, if you could understand as a person who's not very good in studies per se, may be having a specific learning disorder. Right. So when we're looking at slow learner, I'm sure you have something in your mind when you ask this question. But the meaning is someone who has not yet achieved the expected level of their milestones and their potentials, and there could be many neurodevelopmental issues that they could be having.
How early are neurodevelopmental disorders identified?
As early as 1 year, as early as the good doctors with good training, we will be able to identify as early. But the first person to identify is your own family member. Parents know something is off. It's often very difficult when their parents are young parents who are the first child, they tend to miss it a lot. But then mostly by the first years, sometimes even at the time of birth, some conditions are so genetically influenced that a child could be born with just one lobe of the brain, right? So that child is obviously going to be diagnosed with a developmental issue right from the time of birth. But then, if you're looking at the predominant presentation, let's say this is my 1 year old child, he's still not able to, hold his neck. This is my 1 year old child who's still not able to sit down. It's probably mostly the society takes about this 1 year in our culture that they wait. Let's just see for 1 year, and by this time, I think it is quite obvious to them, and they come to us. But as experts, even less than 1 year, you can see the milestones, and you're going to diagnose.
Hello, sir.
Which
Yeah,
disorder is related to Down syndrome?
intellectual disability.
Which disorder is related to Down syndrome?
Yeah, Down syndrome can have problems in all domains. So basically, they will be diagnosed mostly having intellectual disability. So all domains are going to be slower. But the predominant aspect of Down syndrome is most of their severity is of mild severity. They're not going to be so much in terms of their deficits are so high that they're not able to move at all. So there is a rating where you can see how severe is their intellectual disability. So you would usually get a category of mild to moderate level of intellectual disability in Downs. Sometimes they'll also have intellectual disability with features of autism, which means they have also have predominant issues in language and social also. But most of the Down syndromes are very good language and social skills. It's mostly their overall rate in which they're going to learn, which is going to be slow.
For diagnosis of ADHD, do the symptoms need to be expressed at childhood? What if the person only shows symptoms of ADHD at adolescence level or later?
Two things to be noted here. Like I said, there is a spectrum in all of developmental issues. So, if a person is having a very high severity of any kind of developmental delay, more the severity, much earlier, it is going to be obvious for people around the child to identify it much earlier. Then, let's say if the person's having a disability, some kind of a neurodevelopmental level, but it's very mild. This applies to ADHD also. This applies to even any kind of language disorder. It applies to even autism also. So most of the mild things get masked as the person is very much young. And as you know, the person is going to grow, and it's only as they grow the demands from the society keeps increasing. You're not going to express the demand of you sit and prepare for this Olympiad to a newborn child, but you will do it to probably a 10-year-old or even a 15-year-old, right? So the demands are going to increase as the person is growing. And if a person has a very mild level of deficit, it's only after when they are put into a higher demand from their environment that these deficits will start showing up. Now their capacity is now far less than what the environment is demanded, and that's when the diagnosis or in the identification comes. So what happens is when someone is diagnosed very late for ADHD, it doesn't mean they just got ADHD. They've always had these features, but they were quite mild, so that they have been able to cope with these things over a period of time. But it's only now that they're probably not able to manage at this age the current expectations that are being put from the environment. So I hope the meaning is conveyed. You could let me know if you've not got a clear answer.
How does inherent discriminating others come into play in your brain?
Suggested read Gordon Allport. You can note down the name Gordon Allport's Theories of Prejudice. It's an interesting read. Go ahead.
What are some causes for misdiagnosis or not diagnosing people even past childhood?
The environment, if the child's, like I said, the first person to identify is not the doctor, it's the family member, right? If the family member is quite concerned enough to identify and even take action, all of this in a very quick decision making that they're going to go ahead, they're obviously going to get identified much earlier as soon as they see. But if the environment is more of like, let's wait and watch, and if the environment says like, I've seen these children, they will get better slowly only. Let's just wait for it. You're not going to come and get, a consultation, or you're not going to get recognized when you're supposed to get recognized. So it's often the delay in diagnosis is purely a social one. Very rarely, like I said, because the condition is so mild that the problems never turned up in childhood. They turned up much later. It's only when you put them in a situation where the problems are getting, exposed, so they come to you.
When does structural plasticity exactly shift to functional plasticity?
Structural plasticity, unfortunately, from what we understand, is like a very like all your brain development is predominantly 90% is in the first 5 years. So that's the fact we have now established. And the rest of this 10% is predominantly your frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe, which is something which we have discussed today, right? It's probably the most advanced lobe. We call it the neocortex, the evolutionary newer part of the brain. It takes final shaping in terms of the cortical thickness and the maturation till about the age of 25 to 30. So we could safely answer this by saying the structural changes predominantly reach till your early 30s, and but by the time you're 5, the predominant level of your brain's architecture has already been completed.
Is autism really a neurodivergent condition which needs to be cured or altered? What if it's just another condition which we think is abnormal according to the current normalcy graph?
The argument for considering autism as not any diagnostic is purely comes from a person who's, like I've discussed, from a mild spectrum. People who are in the spectrum, but they're not really sure, right? Mild or borderline or very subclinical. You have to see children who are very severe to know that, okay, this is serious. Right. So, yes, you have to diagnose autism because the severity and the kind of disabilities that is contributed to it is going to determine how much you need assistance from support systems like, doctors and therapists. So, the word neurodiversity is still there, and it's very important because most of these subtle conditions who are subclinical or in the mild level can actually mask their symptoms and live a good life. But unfortunately, the label of getting autism as an entity, of a clinical entity, sometimes leads to stigma, right? So that's why we have this entire movement of neurodiversity in the first place, to reduce that stigma. But this entire argument is only pulled within the mild and the borderline levels. When we talk about severe autism, when we have children who are 3, 4 years and still do not have eye contact, 5 years and still non-verbal, you have to intervene, obviously, where you need to recognize the condition, and there is not even a question to talk that let's just ignore the problem. Right? You cannot ignore the problem there. So I hope the message I'm conveying is pretty clear.
Yes, thank you, sir. Next question. How can neurodevelopment be stimulated or induced externally?
You design the experience for it. Again, this is the expertise of the people who offer the treatment services. So, a clinical psychologist, an occupational therapist, or a child psychiatrist like myself, we design activities, we design experiences, we design certain behavioral therapeutic, techniques so that the child is put into that kind of an exposure. Some things are rehearsed again and again. We talked about how learning happens, like we talked about associative learning, we talked about implicit learning through habituation. So these methods are technically designed in ways that the learning is more intensified, and obviously there's the environment that has to offer. The people have to give the kind of games you need to design, the kind of practices that you need to design for this child, so that this particular skill set develops. And you slowly expose the child to these therapies, and you construct one by one all these skills which are not yet there. So you need to train them so that these skills come about. So it's purely what you do from your environment.
The existing neurodivergent toys aims impact on structural or functional plasticity on a higher side.
Again, a play. Tomorrow in the next session, we'll talk a lot about the importance of play in development of cognition. I think you'll get an idea. So play as an experience, right? It's an experience that is going to directly influence your higher cognitive functions. So if it's much earlier in childhood, it's going to assess both. It's going to influence both your structural and functional. But much later in life, that same experience is going to influence more of your functional neuroplasticity. So the answer is based on the age. If you design a toy for an infant, a sensory toy, we'll talk about sensory toys in the next session. So that's actually going to improve the structural aspect. Your parietal lobe, the sensory areas, will show some changes as the child is growing. But then, as you're dealing with a child who's more of a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, the critical periods are all completed. Most of the brain structure is now developed. Still, all your experiences that you offer through these toys and these therapeutic modalities is going to improve certain areas of brain connections. More circuits get again reignited and triggered. So it's going to create that functional plasticity changes.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Hello. Sir, how long will
Yeah.
it take to enter the response of the ADHD?
ADHD. By response, you mean to get recover from the symptoms of ADHD? Is that what you're asking?
No, sir. How long will it take to alter the response of their perspective about the world and
Alter
what
the
they see? Yeah.
Oh, okay, right.
How much will
If
it
you're going to
impact
ask,
on?
if you're going to ask a person who's been having a deficit in their executive functioning right from childhood and are slowly now getting the problems that is caused by these things, and then they've ended up getting diagnosed as ADHD, for them to first get an awareness of these problems itself takes consultations, right? So a
Yes.
lot of times, because ADHD is so subtle, it is not recognized, and the person may not even know that this is caused by a brain issue.
Yes, sir.
So
So can
it
their
is
response
basically
be
your
altered?
process of self-awareness that comes through.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And did I
Can
not
the
catch
response
anything?
be
You can
altered, sir?
actually ask. Yeah.
Sir, can the response be altered, sir?
Yeah, any behaviors has to be learned, and then by learning they can change. But the question of how quickly it will change, that is going to be different for everyone.
Sir, what are the factors?
Sometimes you need treatment for the same also.
Oh, yes, yes, sir.
Severity of ADHD is one of the simplest factors. More severe, obviously, you're going to have some residual problems all through your life. If it's much of a milder issue, let's say a person who's very mild in their severity of ADHD, they'll probably be doing so well as long as they're in school, because now their capacity was good enough there. But then the moment they're in IIT, a big institute with demands, I still remember my days in PJ Chandigarh, the intensity was much on a different level. So some of the environmental demands will expose those issues. That's what we have talked about, right? So in those situations, as long as you're there in that environment, you're going to have the issue. The moment the environment changes, you may not. That also plays a role.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions they want to ask?
Maybe we can have one more question. That's okay. I'm also fine for maybe other 5 minutes.
I put a question in the chat. Basically, this question is, what methods does occupational therapy use to help children who are neurodiverse? And I've also seen that they sometimes people who are dyslexic need physical therapy as well.
So this is why we wanted to include this aspect of sensory integration, because it's going to be quite important for you as toy designers to consider. What an occupational therapist does is they take the core aspect of sensory integration and they analyze the sensory deficits in any person, and especially a child with any kind of developmental issue, and they design sensory stimulatory modalities through equipments, through certain toys, through certain practices, so that whatever area which is lacking that modality of discriminatory modulatory is getting again and again stimulated. That's what an occupational therapist does. And by virtue of sensory integration, like I said, right, sensory integration is as important as any other cognitive function, right? What you are relating to your environment is basically coming through from your sensory integration. How much a person can learn and get exposed to more stimulation is directly dependent upon their sensory capacities. So, what an occupational therapist contributes to the treatment is they'll ensure the sensory systems are as stimulated as possible. So, while other persons are also teaching the child, such as a speech therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist teaching behavioral therapies, are able to give their techniques or behavioral interventions, the sensory system is also equally stimulated to grasp all those things. That's what normally happens in any therapy. There is a multidisciplinary approach between many therapists. So for any developmental child, he or she will be like met by these experts, like a psychiatrist, psychologist, a speech therapist, and occupational therapist put together. And similarly, like you ask for a specific learning disorder, right? So sometimes in specific learning disorder, the issue can be like the kinesthetic integration of symbols, right? When I'm going to imagine A, or I'll give you this modality called let's close your eyes. You close your eyes and you take your palm of your hand and you write A, or ask anyone else to write a letter. Will you able to identify what letter they have written? Of course you will be. So there is a sensory aspect, there is a kinesthetic motor aspect to learning symbols also. So those things are quite utilized in all these therapy modalities. So if there is a deficit of symbolic decoding, you might use these motor kinetic methods to teach them.
Oh, okay.
Sir, I
Thank
have
you. And
a question.
sorry, just one.
You can actually email me. Maybe I could share my email. Probably one more question, and then if it's okay. Yeah.
So the question is, does the sensory integration differ in males and females?
There are always going to be subtle differences in genders in cognitive capacities, but there aren't much evidences. There are studies, of course, but there are very conflicting evidences for the same. So as of now, it's not an established fact that at a sensory level there are gender differences. But in cognition, yes, there are subtle differences.
I think we can conclude with the question answer right now.
Yeah, if it's okay, I was about to share my email ID maybe after the next session, but I'll just place my email ID in the chat. If someone has any specific questions, maybe I think I would try to answer them. I will also request the team from ReWire, if you could take some questions, maybe even integrate them into certain areas that require further clarification. Maybe in the next session, before we start the formal topic, maybe we'll have a couple of these clarifications, if that's okay with you.
Yes, sure. Thank you, sir. So I'd just like to make a few concluding remarks. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Velprashanth, for the insightful and illuminating session. We hope all the participants have gained valuable knowledge from the workshop. The information presented will be essential as you progress through the competition. The recording and presentations from today's session will be made available. Make sure to access them before the next workshop to ensure that you can follow along. Now I'll be announcing some very important details about the competition itself. Our flagship competition, Cognify, invites participants from across India to develop toy concepts that promote cognitive development and inclusivity for neurodivergent children. By joining this competition, you'll have the opportunity to compete for a share of 1 lakh rupees and get your design mass-produced, marketed, and patented in collaboration with Help Them Shine. Additionally, you gain the chance to obtain an internship under Help Them Shine, our title partner. You can also upskill yourself and gain knowledge through these workshops, which will help you present your designs at IIT Madras to industry experts from NIMHANS, AICIM, Help Them Shine, and NID. The next workshop, in continuation to this one, will be held on 24th October at 6:30 p.m. A toy design workshop will be held after that on 28th October by Dr. Austin Davis. The competition consists of 3 rounds, 2 online and 1 offline. Round 1 has already started and will end on 26th October. Here, the participants will complete a questionnaire focused on toy design and neuroscience. Teams that advance will receive personalized mentorship for round 2. Participants will submit a detailed video, written report, or presentation explaining toys design, including blueprints and dimensions. The finalists of this round will present their physical prototypes at IIT Madras during Shaastra 2025. I would like to thank Dr. Velprashanth Venkatesan again for the amazing session. I would also like to thank our title partner, Help Them Shine, for their contributions to our initiative. Help Them Shine is the first company in India that offers global therapeutic and therapy products for special needs children. It is run by the parents of special needs children. To know more, please visit their website at www.helpthemshine.com. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to attend this workshop. Best of luck for round 1. If you have any questions or are interested in collaborating, please feel free to contact us at ReWire@shastra.org. Please ensure that you and your teammates join the WhatsApp group, as this is mandatory for facilitating further communication. Also, make sure to share and spread the word about this competition with others who may be interested. Please fill the feedback form. We are sending it in the chat. Please make sure to fill it out. Thank you.